Welcome to the 28th episode of Arbiter Worlds. If you're a returning subscriber, thanks for supporting the channel. If you're new to the channel, hello. Here at Arbiter Worlds, we study the art and science of running and creating tabletop role-playing games. Before I start today's video, I want to make an important announcement. The Adventurer Conqueror King system Imperial imprint will begin crowdfunding on October 24th on Kickstarter. If you are a supporter of the simulationist renaissance, of open-world sandbox gaming focused on player agency, then Axe 2 is the game for you. There's a special bonus item for everyone who backs the game on day one, so put it on your calendars. October 24th. Today, we're going to delve deep into the design theory of simulationist RPGs. We're going to open that explanation with a definition. A simulationist game is one in which the structure of the rules isomorphically maps to the structure of reality being simulated to an extent sufficient to create meaningful verisimilitude. Now, that definition is what we might call value-laden. It requires some further elaboration. To make sense of it, we're going to need to define some additional foundations. The ancient Greek philosopher Plato famously asserted that our faculties of sense perception could not lead us to truth about the world, only to opinions about the world. Truth, he argued, had to be apprehended directly through the faculty he called nous, the ability of the human mind to understand what is real, the ability to make reality intelligible, the ability to perceive the noetic. In order for Plato to make this epistemological assertion, he had to make two metaphysical commitments. The first is that reality is real. The second is that reality is intelligible as a principle of cosmic order, the latter principle often called the logos. In Plato's day, opposition to these commitments largely came from the sophists, who were close to what we would today call postmodern relativists. Plato was largely successful in his intellectual fight with them, and from his era until the time of the scholastics, these two principles were accepted by most philosophers. Starting in the early modern era, these two metaphysical commitments were rejected by the likes of Kant, Hume, and others. When they were discarded, so was the possibility of any noetic faculty. The implications of this are way too broad for this RPG video. Briefly stated, in today's philosophical debate, the sophists have the upper hand to such an extent that it's utterly common to encounter viewpoints such as truth is just a social construct, reality is just a consensus, and you can't really know anything. And that's all taken for granted. Now, obviously, if reality is not real, or if it's not intelligible, it cannot be apprehended. And in that case, simulation of reality is impossible. There's no reality to simulate. And even if there were, there'd be no intelligible structure by which to do so. So if reality is not real and intelligible, all we can hope to do is create a subjective and phenomenological story based on our sense experience. So in other words, for a sophist, Ford-style narrativism would be an accurate model of the world. From a postmodern or sophistic perspective, what we perceive as reality isn't real. It's just a story we tell ourselves. And from that postmodern perspective, my assertion that my games are simulations is a metaphysical claim to knowledge that they would deny that I or anyone can have. It's epistemological arrogance that deserves to be mocked as self-deluded, according to them. Conversely, if reality is real, if reality is intelligible, then simulation of reality is possible specifically by isomorphic mapping of the structure of reality to the structure of the game rules. And doing so isn't an exercise in epistemological hubris. It's an exercise in the highest faculty of the human mind, of nous, and it touches on what Tolkien called the act of subcreation. Now, obviously, I am not going to settle this 2,500-year-old philosophical debate in my quirky RPG YouTube channel. But I think it's important to lay out these philosophical presumptions because a lot of the criticism of simulationism really boils down to sophistry in the original sense of the word. So for the rest of the video, I'm going to accept as an axiom or philosophical commitment that reality is real and intelligible. If you disagree, at least you know where I'm coming from. Okay. So having made that philosophical commitment, I'm going to call the measure of the simulation's isomorphism to reality its verisimilitude. And we can then theorize that the pleasure of participating in a simulation arises in part from a noetic appreciation of the simulation's verisimilitude. Now, what is noetic appreciation of verisimilitude? Noetic apprehension of verisimilitude is the inverse of willing suspension of disbelief. When we engage in the willing suspension of disbelief, we put aside what we know to be true in order to better appreciate something fictional. When we engage in noetic apprehension of verisimilitude, we use what we know to be true in order to better appreciate something fictional. Now, people differ markedly in their willingness to engage in suspension of disbelief. About 20 years ago, I wrote an essay for The Escapist, the gaming website I founded, called "It's All Real to Me." And in that essay, I said, too often verisimilitude is dismissed with smug statements like the fans' expectations are too high. But the irony is that it's the other way around. The fans' expectations are too low. The fans will watch vomit congealing if it's got the brand they love attached to it. I should know because I was in line for the Phantom Menace on opening day. Expectations are higher, not lower, among mainstream consumers, much higher. The reason Joe Super Bowl doesn't like Star Trek or Fantastic Four or Halo isn't because those settings seem too real, it's because they don't seem real enough. For whatever reason, those settings can't immerse the average consumer enough, they can't overcome his skepticism, they can't make Joe Super Bowl believe. Right. And it's not just fantasy or science fiction that require willing suspension of disbelief. All of us have had the experience of watching a true crime, a war, a horse movie with a subject matter expert who can't enjoy the film because it's not realistic. The experience is so common, it's been parodied on YouTube. When you finish watching this, check out the clip from the beauty Equestrian Watches Black Beauty to see what I mean. We've all been there. Now, what's far less understood or talked about is the opposite experience, and that is the experience of watching a movie as a subject matter expert and enjoying the film because it's so realistic. Let's watch this clip of military historian Roel Konynendik discussing the 2004 movie Alexander.
I mean, this movie had an Oxford professor advising on the movie. You can see all the little details that they got, you know, in terms of their dress, in terms of their tactics and maneuvers. Like, all of this is as good as we can get it almost. It's really, you know, really precise. With this movie, like, all the equipment is just right. Like, these guys, you know, these are the companions. You know later on there are going to be some Thracians. Like, you can pinpoint very exactly who they are. The whole pike phalanx is exactly depicted accurately with all of the weaponry and the spacing between the men and the kind of blocks in which they maneuver and things like that. I mean, this is exactly as it says in the sources. This is our best reconstruction of how this battle happened. This is, you know, in terms of ancient warfare, this is the most accurate depiction that you'll find anywhere. And I would give this 9 out of 10.
All right. So the pleasure that Professor K is taking in watching this movie Alexander, it has nothing to do with the narrative arc of Alexander's rise and fall. That would be narrativism. It has nothing to do with the acting of Colin Farrell, which might be dramatism, or with his excitement about how the action might play out, which would be gameism. No, the pleasure that Professor K is taking is the noetic appreciation of verisimilitude. If you don't know anything about Hellenistic warfare, all of the detail that so impressed Professor K might be lost on you. Does that make those details worthless? Well, not to me, not to Oliver Stone, who spent millions of dollars to get those details right. He knew that for some of the audience it would matter. For me, for Professor K, for other people, it did. Analogy. We can eat a meal because we are hungry and need nutrition. But we can also eat a meal because we know it stimulates our taste buds in pleasurable ways, and the meal can do both things. Likewise, we can play a tabletop RPG because we want drama or challenge, but we can also play a tabletop RPG because we know it will stimulate our noetic faculty in pleasurable ways. Verisimilitude is a sensation that we experience, and creating that sensory experience can be a design goal in and of itself alongside other design goals. So when GNS theory suggests that simulation is inherently incompatible with challenge or narrative, it's wrong. It's as wrong as saying that sweet is inherently incompatible with sour or that salty is incompatible with savory, when in fact it's the complement of the sensations that can create the more pleasurable eating experience. Likewise, the combination of enjoying challenge, drama, and simulation can create a more pleasurable gaming experience. So to summarize our position, a simulationist game is one in which the structure of the rules isomorphically maps to the structure of the reality being simulated to an extent sufficient to create meaningful verisimilitude, and the particular pleasure of a simulationist game arises non-exclusively from the noetic appreciation of the game's verisimilitude. Next episode, we're going to discuss isomorphic mapping and the map-territory relationship and address some of the common criticisms that are directed at simulationist efforts. For now, please isomorphically map your mouse cursor to the location of the like and subscribe buttons, and then noetically appreciate the comments about today's episode. And I will see you next week.